All right, welcome back to the lecture. Today's topic is the 30 Years' War, or as you know, the idea that unfortunately things are going to get worse before they get worse. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the religious strife and the sort of consequences politically and socially of the Protestant reformations in places like England and Spain and the Netherlands, and especially France. Now we're going to shift over a little bit and basically talk about the region that is modern day Germany primarily. 30 Years' War is a terrible, terrible event running from 1618 to 1648, where much of Germany was, at the time known as the Holy Roman Empire, and it is essentially devastated. It remains one of the longest running and most brutal wars in human history, with more than 8 million casualties resulting from battles, plus, even worse, and this is what makes it so terrible, the famine and disease that the conflict caused. And we'll get into that a little bit more. It's really a battle, and this is really also frustrating and quite terrible that it takes place between Catholics and Protestant states. And you have Christians fighting Christians, right? And the war, as the war evolved, however, though, we, to be fair, need to acknowledge that it ends up becoming less and less about religion and more about who's going to end up running Europe and, what the geopolitical landscape is going to look like and who's going to control what parts and what land, and economics becomes a factor. So it starts with religion, and it's certainly by the end of the war is more about politics and power and economics. So let's talk about what happens here in terms of causes of the war. The ascension of Emperor Ferdinand to the head of the Holy Roman Empire, which is really modern Germany. It's a confusing term because it's not really Roman, but they have a connection to Rome with Catholicism, and so they try to act like they're sort of picking up on that. So it begins with Ferdinand II, his succession in 1619. And when the war starts, as some of the things are beginning to happen, it really kind of starts in 1618, but we really say it kicks off in 1619. Because one of Ferdinand's first actions is to force citizens of his empire to become Roman Catholics, even though religious freedom had already been granted as part of the Peace of Augsburg. So the Holy Roman Empire forces the Bohemians, or the main group that are Protestants, to return to the Roman Catholic Church. And this violates the treaty known as the Peace of Augsburg, which had basically been the first attempt to kind of have religious freedom. And it had worked to this point in having the Protestants and Catholics in the same region without there being a bunch of war. So this basically is just a treaty that had ended religious struggle between the two main groups in Germany and made a legal division of Christianity within the Holy Roman Empire. Again, that's modern Germany for the most part. Unfortunately, Ferdinand then undoes all of that, and so this is a major problem. After Ferdinand's decree, we also have major consequences, which really begin with the first phase of the war, the so-called defenestration of Prague. So naturally, the people who are Protestants and have some power, especially Protestant nobles, in present-day Austria and Czech Republic, which were part of the Holy Roman Empire as well, reject this, and they showed their displeasure. As you can see, the artist captured this by, Ferdinand, his representatives are thrown out of a window at the Prague Castle in 1618. So again, this is why we go back to 1618, even though 1619 is really the important year as well. And so this is called the defenestration of Prague. Defenestration is actually, of course, it means windows and doors, right? And to throw them out. And so the windows and doors, throwing people out the windows and doors is really the launching point of the 30 Years' War. And so in response to Ferdinand's decision to take away religious freedom, the primarily Protestant northern parts of the Holy Roman Empire seek to break away. Further fragmenting and already loosely structured areas which had a lot of problems really are the first ones to really try and do this. The first stage of the 30 Years' War is really called the Bohemian Revolt to reflect that region, and it becomes a truly continental conflict in due time. It's almost a precursor in a lot of ways to like World War I in terms of its scope. It's really a continental war, not just a world war, but it's continental war, and it's devastating. I think you could safely say it's one of the worst 5 conflicts in human history. Of course, both world wars would kind of take the top spots there, but this one's pretty close on their heels. Now, over the first decade plus of fighting, the Bohemian nobility formed alliances with other Protestant states, and it's called the Protestant Union. So they're these smaller Protestant states in parts of Western Germany that are going to ally with the Bohemian nobility. Meanwhile, Ferdinand sought the support of his Catholic nephew, Philip IV of Spain, because Spain is still Catholic. Soon, armies for both sides are really engaged in a brutal warfare on multiple fronts. In present-day Austria, Germany, Transylvania, where Ottoman Empire Muslims soldiers fought alongside the Protestants against the Poles, you have the side of the Holy Roman Empire, and it gets very messy. And it's a lot like World War I as well, where these alliances all come together and it makes it an even bigger conflict. To the west, Spain is allied with the Catholic League in present-day Germany, Belgium and France, who support Ferdinand II. So I don't need to tell you all the nitty-gritty details of this, but I do need you to know that this is very messy. And broadly speaking, we have Protestants on one side with their allies, and then we have Catholic nations and their allies on the other. Initially, Ferdinand's forces are rather successful. They quell the rebellion to the east and in northern Austria. Eventually, the Protestant Union breaks apart. However, fighting still continues in the west, where Denmark and Norway get involved, and they support the Protestant states. So it continues to escalate. Then Scotland gets involved, but Denmark and Norway actually initially lose to Ferdinand, ceding much of Northern Europe to the emperors of the war was, what they had to do, and it was going pretty well for roughly the first half of it. And then Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden enters into the fray. So now we've got practically all of the major players at this point. And we haven't really actually referenced England itself. We did talk about Scotland there for a second, but it extended all the way into Scandinavia in terms of nations involved. They're not really fighting in Scandinavia, but Scandinavian nations are coming down and taking part in the conflict under the leadership of Adolphus, who is a Protestant, and they actually begin to push the Catholic forces back and regain much of the territory that they had lost, this is why it's such a long battle, a series of battles in war, because you take the territory and then all of a sudden they come back, but the goal in most wars is just to take the territory, but that's not really this. There was a Catholic-Protestant division here also, and so while it may look like, oh, well, we took the territory, we won the war, no, now we have these other people coming in from outside who are fighting for Protestants, and these Protestant victories are going to continue until he gets killed, and but the biggest victory was at the Battle of Britain Field, where he defeated a very large Catholic force. And it looked like most observers that, the Protestants had really swung the momentum back in their favor just basically 1 year later. And then at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Adolphus gets killed in battle, and then all bets are off. From there, it gets worse and worse and worse and more messy. Because not that it wasn't already, but the Bohemian nobleman, this Protestant nobleman named Albert von Wallenstein, he provides an army with about 50,000 soldiers to Ferdinand in exchange for the freedom to capture any plundered territories in the previous Bohemian region. And, that had been against Ferdinand. And he's actually going to supply Ferdinand with these 50,000 troops in exchange for the ability to basically just capture any territory he wants. And by 1635, the Swedes end up being defeated, and that's, a couple years after Adolphus had died. And now you have this idea of plunder, something that, we need to talk about, because the horrors of war are really, one of the worst things about this war. And you look at this scene, it's not a battlefield. This is a castle. They're storming a fort, and they're going to take innocent women and children, and these are the people who are going to be the real victims of this war, because they're just going to slaughter everybody, and dogs and birds and everything. And they don't care who wins. This is now about politics and taking whatever they wanted. And, these women and children, they probably want food and they want peace, but this idea of being allowed to plunder whatever they want really steps up the horrors of this war. And it brings home really how terrible it is. And again, another example here, we're outside of a town. It's not a battlefield, it's a town. And you can see the innocent men and women and children just being slaughtered. Some of the soldiers here are using force to, enforce this idea of loot and plunder. And that's what makes it so terrible, that they all kind of get swept up into this huge tide of war. And it gets pretty grisly, and it's really important for us to take this stuff seriously, that kind of all bets kind of just went off. It got very personal. You also have the Hanging by James Calais, and this is again going to involve some mass persecutions as well. The victors, are going to round up and kill the dissenters whenever they get a chance, and they would just hang them from trees, every branch of trees, and just hang people. It's very brutal conflict through and through. Now, as the war moves on, it eventually is going to end, of course. Thankfully, the French get involved. And though they're Catholic, and now this is a really important point, and we don't have a separate slide, but you do need to note, it's important to not always give, everything to you on the slide. You really do need to listen. But it's really important that there's a major shift in the war, because the French, though Catholics, are rivals of the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs. And they didn't like the initial peace treaty that signed the Peace of Prague when the Swedes left, and they actually get involved in another conflict. But they are against Ferdinand. So now, this turning point in the war, about halfway through, it's clearly not about religion anymore. It started as Catholic versus Protestant, but now you have a major Catholic power, France, joining the Protestant cause, which tells us that religion is not the sole motivating factor anymore. And meanwhile, Spain is fighting at the behest of Ferdinand's successor, because Ferdinand has died. Now it's Ferdinand III, for control of the Holy Roman Empire. They mount counterattacks, they invade French territory, and France and Spain are constantly going at it. They almost capture Paris in 1636. And, the French actually rally, and from this near disaster, they keep fighting for the Protestants. Then Portugal, a couple years later, they rebel against Spain. Again, you don't have to have every single detail, but you can see how this just domino effect of just people revolting and people rebelling and then joining sides and then picking the other side and then joining another side and then having somebody else come in from the outside. 1643, Denmark and Norway take up arms again. They had been defeated about 10 years before that, and they decide now they're going to fight for the Holy Roman Empire. So they're a group that has basically changed who they're fighting for after losing initially. Around the same time, France loses Louis XIII. He leaves the throne to his son, Louis XIV, and we're going to talk about him in the absolute power module and the ensuing years after that. But the French army has several victories, but also significant defeats. The problem is now that Louis is only 5 years old, Louis XIV. And so you have this power vacuum in France. Finally, 1647, the Habsburgs forces led by Ottavio Piccolini were able to repel the Swedes and the French from what is now Austria. And in that year after that, they finally are going to end this thing in 1684 at the Battle of Prague. And they finally captured the castle, and from the forces of the Holy Roman Empire were able to take the bulk of the city, and we get to the Peace of Westphalia. So various parties will sign the peace, effectively ending the 30 Years' War. It has major effects on the boundaries and geopolitics in Europe. Spain loses grip on Portugal and on the Netherlands, and we had already kind of talked about that. The peace accords also granted autonomy to Holy Roman Empire states, and so basically all the smaller German-speaking states in Central Europe. But it also stipulates that this, and this is super important, and it really works for a while, that the European states would be recognized as sovereign and equal. The idea that the Holy Roman Empire can't just tell everybody what to do is not going to happen anymore, right? They're not going to be able to just say, oh, we're all the Holy Roman Empire. And their domestic affairs are all going to be protected by this Peace of Westphalia. And so kind of remember that. And this is what the Peace of Westphalia does, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. England is pretty obvious. France is pretty obvious. Spain is pretty obvious. And then you have this gigantic jigsaw puzzle. So again, there's a lot to be sorted out. The area that had been previously controlled by the Habsburgs, known as the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, several other Eastern Bloc nations are all going to be broken up into little tiny sections. And we want to make sure that we reinforce, the very sad part of this legacy. Ultimately, the Peace of Westphalia is a good thing. It lays the groundwork for the formation of the modern nation states of Europe. It establishes fixed boundaries, protected domestic rights for each nation, effectively decreed that residents of the states were subject to the laws of that state and not those of any other institution, whether it's secular or religious. It said the Catholic Church can't just come in and tell everybody what to do, and that's radically going to alter the way Europe works and the balance of power in Europe. And it does reduce the influence of the Catholic Church. It's probably an unavoidable outcome of the Protestant Reformations politically at this point, and because they're not going to reunite with the Catholic Church, and it really is going to take a hit in power to the Catholic Church. But the fighting was brutal, and if that wasn't bad enough, that there's millions of deaths that result from famine caused by this conflict. There's an epidemic of typhus and disease that spread very rapidly during in war-torn areas, and historians believe that the first witch hunt kind of starts during this time. And so the war starts, you have this very crazy amount of things going on. People start being burned as witches, because of, the spiritualization of these causes and the confusion. And this map is showing you here the amount of population lost in parts of Germany during this war. In some places in the deep red colors, it's greater than 2/3 of the population. That's insane, but it's hard to wrap your head around. If you're sitting in a class of 30, right, only 10 people would be left standing. Everybody else would have been dead. And that's how people in the region, that's how many people are gone, and it's staggering. The devastation is really, really, really terrible in terms of loss of life. And then you have the mercenary armies, which we talked about, that are just devastating crops. They're coming in, they're gobbling up all the resources, they're looting everything. You have increased fear in communities throughout Europe and a lot of distrust, which is one of the major byproducts about this, especially with ethnicity and a religious faith. And those sentiments are going to last a long time and really be the basis for anti-Semitism that's going to take place and become famous during World War II about 300 years later. And it has, its seeds here in the 30 Years' War. Let's talk about the outcomes and kind of call it a module in terms of video lectures. The Catholic Church no longer rules an empire. They don't have that kind of power anymore. Several modern nations are created and talked about. France and Sweden will now become, for the first time, the most powerful nations before England. And then nearly everybody is broke. The armies were too large. They had to pay mercenary armies, and it's all entirely too expensive. Huge economic issues come along with that. There is more religious freedom, though. It tends to be regionalized in terms of the dominant sort of religion, just like everywhere else, but you predominantly, have this religion here and that religion there. You have Catholics in Southern Europe, Lutherans in Central Germany, Calvinists in Northern Europe. But power now very crucially will shift from religion to economics, and will give into things like capitalism, things like that moving forward. So for the rest of this, make sure you just kind of review all of this and go back and make sure you understand just how devastating this time frame was and how it's really going to lead to the problems that are going to end up being World War I and World War II several hundred years later. And that's going to bring us to an end of our module.